In the shadows of an unassuming Atlanta church, a horror beyond imagination unfolded. On April 3rd, 2023, the sanctuary's morning silence was shattered by a scream that would forever echo through its walls. Pastor Samuel Wilson lay dismembered in his study, his body methodically separated into 12 distinct parts, arranged in a grotesque display that left even veteran detectives stunned. The ceremonial communion knife, still stained with dried blood, rested atop an open Bible. This wasn't random violence. This was execution, delivered with chilling precision. Security footage revealed only one visitor during the night: Darius Jackson, successful real estate developer, devoted father, and the man whose donations had kept the struggling congregation afloat for years. What drives a respected community leader with no criminal history to commit an act of such calculated brutality against a man of God? The answer lies in what investigators would uncover next. 3 women from a single family, a wife, a daughter, and a sister, all harboring devastating secrets tied to one pastor. A small church's finances in disarray. Missing donation money. Cryptic sermon notes targeting one man's darkest trauma. When detectives uncovered a series of hidden recordings, what emerged was a psychological chess match between 2 master manipulators that escalated beyond anyone's imagination. The final sermon, delivered just hours before the murder, contained coded language that would trigger a dormant rage decades in the making. This isn't just another case of religious violence. This is a story of betrayal so profound, it transformed faith into fury, leaving a community forever shattered. This is the Devil's Verse. The morning of April 3rd, 2023, began unremarkably in the quiet Atlanta suburb of Rosewood Hills. At precisely 9:17 a.m., church janitor Leroy Brown arrived for his regular Monday cleaning duties at the small brick church where Pastor Samuel Wilson had preached for the last 8 years. Brown, a 62-year-old who had maintained the church facilities for over a decade, noticed something unusual immediately. The pastor's private study light remained on from the night before, a rare occurrence given Wilson's meticulous habits. What happened next would launch one of the most disturbing homicide investigations in recent memory. "I knocked first, like I always do," Brown later told detectives. "When nobody answered, I used my key. That's when I saw him, or what was left of him." The scene that greeted Brown defied comprehension. Pastor Samuel Wilson's body had been systematically dismembered, the parts arranged with deliberate precision around his desk. His torso remained seated in his chair, while his severed head had been placed atop an open Bible on the desk. The remaining body parts formed a semicircle on the floor. Blood spatter analysis would later reveal the dismemberment occurred in that very room over a period of approximately 90 minutes. By 9:24 a.m., the first police units arrived. Detectives secured the scene and began the painstaking process of documenting what many would later describe as ritualistic in its execution. The murder weapon, a silver communion knife used in Sunday services, was found wiped clean of fingerprints, but coated with the victim's blood. The medical examiner determined Wilson died between 11:30 p.m. and 1:15 a.m. In 15 years working homicide, I've never seen this level of methodical dismemberment in a crime of passion, noted one detective in his preliminary report. The killer took their time. They weren't rushed. They weren't sloppy. This suggests a perpetrator who wanted not just to kill, but to obliterate. As crime scene technicians processed evidence, detectives began interviewing those closest to Pastor Wilson. His wife, Maya Wilson, collapsed upon hearing the news. Through tears, she revealed something that shifted the investigation's direction almost immediately. "Samuel had been acting strange lately," she told detectives, "locking drawers that were never locked before, taking phone calls outside. 2 weeks ago, he told me someone at the church was watching him too closely. I thought he was being paranoid. Wilson's church, though modest in size with approximately 200 regular attendees, had recently completed a renovation funded primarily by one congregant, Darius Jackson, a 48-year-old real estate developer whose family occupied the front row every Sunday. Financial records showed Jackson had donated over $500,000 to the church building fund in the past 3 years, an extraordinary sum for a congregation of its size. The investigation took its first critical turn when technicians discovered the church's main security system had been disabled between 10:15 p.m. and 2:15 a.m. on the night of the murder. According to church records, only 4 people possessed the security code: Pastor Wilson, his administrative assistant Brianna Jackson, Elder Clarence Williams, and the church treasurer Naomi Jackson. The connection was immediate and striking. Both the church treasurer and the pastor's assistant shared the same last name as the church's primary benefactor. Detectives quickly confirmed they were the wife and sister of Darius Jackson. At 2:35 p.m., investigators made their breakthrough. A secondary camera system installed during renovations but not connected to the main security panel captured grainy but unmistakable footage of a black Mercedes SUV entering the church parking lot at 10:12 p.m. and leaving at 1:26 a.m., directly within the medical examiner's estimated time of death. The vehicle was registered to Darius Jackson. When detectives arrived at the Jackson residence, a sprawling 7,000-square-foot home in Rosewood Hills' most exclusive section, they found Darius in his home office reviewing property documents. According to the official report, Jackson displayed an unnerving calmness inconsistent with someone about to be questioned in a homicide investigation. During initial questioning, Jackson acknowledged being at the church that Sunday night, but claimed he was there to review financial records, and left by 11 p.m. before the pastor arrived for his typical Sunday evening prayers. When confronted with the security footage showing his departure after 1 a.m., Jackson's demeanor reportedly changed. There was a moment when something shifted behind his eyes, one detective noted. He simply said, "Then I must have lost track of time. No explanation, no alibi adjustment, just acceptance that we'd caught him in a lie." A search warrant executed on Jackson's vehicle revealed trace evidence that would later prove crucial. Microscopic blood spatter on the steering wheel matched Pastor Wilson's DNA, despite evidence of recent and thorough cleaning. The case took another dramatic turn when crime scene technicians discovered a hidden compartment in Pastor Wilson's desk containing a burner phone. The device held hundreds of text messages between the pastor and someone identified only as NJ in the contacts. The most recent message, sent at 9:17 p.m. on the night of the murder, read, "He knows about us. Not sure how. Meeting him tonight to talk. Don't try to reach me. I'll call when it's safe." When detectives interviewed Naomi Jackson the following morning, she initially denied any inappropriate relationship with Pastor Wilson. When presented with the text messages, however, her composure crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she reportedly told detectives. "Darius was always working. Samuel was there for me. He understood me." What began as a shocking murder investigation was rapidly developing into something far more complex. The detectives now faced critical questions. Was this simply a husband's rage upon discovering his wife's infidelity? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family and their relationship with Pastor Wilson? The answer would come from an unexpected source, Genesis Jackson, the 21-year-old daughter of Darius and Naomi, who walked into the police station voluntarily the day after her father's questioning. "You have it all wrong," she told detectives. "My father didn't kill Pastor Wilson because of my mother. He killed him because of me." To understand the murder that shocked Atlanta's Rosewood Hills community requires examining how a modest brick church became the center of manipulation, financial impropriety, and deadly secrets. Samuel Wilson arrived in Atlanta in 2015, a relatively unknown minister from Charlotte, North Carolina, with little more than a rented U-Haul and ambitious vision. At 37, Wilson possessed the charismatic presence that smaller congregations often seek. Articulate, conventionally handsome, with a deep voice that commanded attention, whether preaching or engaged in casual conversation. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, recalled Clarence Williams, a church elder who served on the hiring committee. When he spoke about growing our congregation, about reaching the community, you couldn't help but believe him. We were a church of barely 50 members then, struggling to keep our lights on. Wilson's background appeared impeccable on paper. Seminary education from a respected institution in Virginia. Previous assistant pastor positions at 3 churches across the Southeast. Glowing recommendation letters describing his fundraising abilities and community outreach. What the hiring committee didn't know, and what detectives would later uncover, was that each previous position had ended under circumstances carefully concealed through non-disclosure agreements. Within 6 months of Wilson's arrival, the small congregation had nearly doubled in size. His modern approach to traditional teachings attracted younger families without alienating longtime members. Sunday collections increased by 40%. By his 1-year anniversary, the church had cleared its outstanding debts. This rapid growth coincided with the arrival of the Jackson family in February 2016. To those in Atlanta's Rosewood Hills community, the Jacksons represented Black excellence in its most complete form. Financial success, family stability, and generous community engagement. Yet, the investigation into Pastor Wilson's murder would reveal the carefully constructed facade, hiding a family under extraordinary pressure. Darius Jackson's rise from modest beginnings to real estate magnate embodied the American dream. Born in 1975 to working-class parents in East Atlanta, Jackson distinguished himself early through academic achievement. Financial aid and scholarships funded his education at Georgia State University, where he earned a business degree in 1997, followed by an MBA in 2001. He wasn't born with connections or family money, noted his former business partner, who spoke to investigators. Darius built everything through sheer determination and strategic thinking. He could walk into a neglected neighborhood and envision exactly what it could become. Jackson's company began in 2005 as a small residential renovation company. Tax records show the business grossing barely $180,000 its first year. By 2010, annual revenue exceeded $2.3 million. The company's breakthrough came in 2014 with a 45-unit luxury development that transformed a formerly distressed property into homes selling for $750,000 and above. By 2020, Darius Jackson's personal net worth was estimated at $15 million. This professional success appeared matched by personal fulfillment. Darius and Naomi's marriage in 2000 produced daughter Genesis the following year. Their family photographs, displayed prominently throughout their home, portrayed the ideal family unit: smiling vacation images, graduation celebrations, holiday gatherings. Naomi Jackson presented as the perfect complement to her husband's ambition. With a background in accounting from Spelman College, she managed the complex finances of both their household and business interests. Community members described her as polished, sophisticated, and the backbone of the family's social standing. Naomi knew everyone worth knowing, a fellow church member told detectives. She organized the charity galas, served on nonprofit boards, maintained their social calendar. She was the one who initially suggested the family join Pastor Wilson's congregation. What friends didn't see were the strains developing behind closed doors. Credit card statements revealed Darius spent more than 200 nights in hotels during 2022 alone. Phone records showed declining communication between husband and wife, from multiple daily calls in 2019 to sometimes days without contact by early 2023. Forensic examination of Naomi's personal computer uncovered searches for signs of cheating husband and how to save a loveless marriage, beginning in late 2020. By mid-2021, these searches shifted dramatically to divorce assets protection and hidden bank accounts, coinciding with the period when her relationship with Pastor Wilson intensified. Genesis Jackson's carefully curated social media presence showed a confident young woman thriving at Spelman College, following her mother's footsteps. Her public posts highlighted academic achievements, social justice involvement, and church youth leadership. Yet, academic records told a different story. Her GPA had dropped from 3.8 to 2.3 between freshman and junior years. Course registration showed multiple withdrawn classes by spring 2023. Most concerning were text messages recovered from Genesis's phone. Communications with her few remaining close friends revealed increasing isolation. "Can't meet up tonight. Pastor S needs help with the youth service," read one typical exchange. Another message from February 2023 stated, "Mom wouldn't understand. Pastor S says some spiritual connections are beyond what ordinary people can comprehend." The addition of Brianna Jackson to the household in 2016 added another layer of complexity to the family dynamic. 7 years younger than her brother Darius, Brianna had left Charlotte abruptly, bringing her then 6-year-old son with virtually no explanation to extended family members. Investigation into Brianna's background revealed a troubling pattern of relationships with authority figures. Employment records from 3 previous nursing positions showed resignations under unclear circumstances. Her ex-husband, interviewed by detectives, described her as always searching for someone to tell her what to do after growing up with their authoritarian father. Her son, age 13 at the time of the murder, had been sent to boarding school in Virginia in August 2022, a decision made shortly after Brianna's promotion to Director of Pastoral Care. Bank records showed Pastor Wilson personally paid half the tuition through a church discretionary fund. Perhaps most telling about the Jackson family was the physical layout of their 7,000 square foot residence. Security system logs revealed increasingly separate lives. By 2023, Darius primarily occupied the home's east wing, including a private office, bedroom, and separate entrance. Naomi maintained spaces in the main portion of the house, while Brianna's guest house had been renovated to include a private kitchenette and entrance, allowing her to come and go unnoticed. While the community saw only the Jackson family's continued generosity, financial investigators discovered Darius had leveraged multiple properties to maintain appearances. By March 2023, his actual liquid assets had decreased by nearly 60% from their 2020 peak. The most disturbing evidence of family dysfunction emerged from the home security system. Footage from March 2023 showed Darius and Naomi in a heated argument in their kitchen. Though the system recorded no audio, forensic lip readers later determined Naomi said, "You're never here anyway. This marriage has been over for years." Darius responded, "You have no idea what I've sacrificed to keep this family together." 3 days later, security logs recorded Darius accessing the rarely used central control panel, where he reviewed weeks of archived footage tracking the comings and goings of both Naomi and Brianna. Camera angles showed him making notes of specific timestamps when both women left for church meetings at unusual hours. What Darius Jackson discovered during those critical days in late March would shift his perception of not just his family, but his entire life. Phone records show he made no business calls during this period, highly unusual for a man who typically logged dozens daily. Instead, he visited financial institutions, met with his personal attorney, and spent hours alone in his office reviewing documents. The model family that had stood in the front row every Sunday, that had funded church renovations, that had represented Black achievement to an entire community, was fracturing under pressures no one outside could see. By the week of Pastor Wilson's murder, Darius Jackson had begun systematically investigating the true relationship between his family and their spiritual leader. The question investigators now faced: Was Darius Jackson simply a husband and father driven to violence upon discovering his wife's infidelity? Or was there something far more disturbing behind the dismemberment of Pastor Samuel Wilson? On March 26, 2023, exactly 1 week before his murder, Pastor Samuel Wilson stood before his congregation for what would be his final public address. The sermon, entitled "Reaping What You Sow," would later prove to be much more than a spiritual message. It was a calculated psychological maneuver in what investigators would discover was a years-long game of manipulation, exploitation, and control. The church's video archive captured the entire 47-minute sermon. To the average congregant, Wilson's message appeared to be a standard, if somewhat intense, discussion of divine justice. But forensic analysis of both the sermon content and the pastor's delivery revealed a different narrative occurring beneath the surface. Most sermons follow predictable theological patterns, explained Dr. Davids, a forensic linguist who analyzed the recording for investigators. What made Wilson's final address so unusual was its layered messaging, one meaning for the general congregation, and another directed specifically at a single listener. That listener was Darius Jackson, seated in his customary front row position. Security footage reveals a striking anomaly in his behavior that morning. Rather than his usual engaged expressions, nodding, taking occasional notes, Jackson sat completely motionless throughout the address, his gaze never leaving the pastor. The sermon began with Wilson reciting Galatians 6:7-8. "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction." Wilson then departed from his usual expository style, instead weaving a narrative about a man who built his house upon another's foundation. While seemingly metaphorical, the story contained specific details that paralleled Jackson's real estate development approach. Wilson described how the wise builder appears to create, but truly only takes what belongs to others, reshaping it for his own glory. These weren't random examples, noted Davids. Wilson's manuscript, recovered from his computer, shows he rewrote this section 12 times, refining the parallels to Jackson's business while maintaining plausible deniability. The sermon's middle section focused on biblical accounts of powerful men undone by pride. Wilson dwelled particularly on King David, who committed adultery with Bathsheba before arranging her husband's death. Digital enhancement of the video shows Wilson making sustained eye contact with Naomi Jackson during these passages, causing visible discomfort. Most telling was the sermon's final 10 minutes, which forensic psychologists have described as textbook psychological warfare. Wilson shifted to discussing how sins committed in youth often return in maturity, and how the Lord knows what is buried, even when men believe evidence has long been covered. This section contained a reference that seemed innocuous to most listeners, but carried devastating significance for Darius Jackson. Wilson stated, "Like the son who struck down his tormentor and buried the evidence beneath the floorboards, thinking no one would ever know, the blood still cries out from the ground." The reference aligns precisely with details about Darius Jackson's childhood that emerged during the investigation. At age 17, Jackson killed his violently abusive father after a particularly brutal assault on his mother. The death was ruled accidental, with investigators concluding the father fell downstairs during an argument. Only 3 people knew the truth: Darius, his deceased mother, and Naomi, whom he had confided in early in their marriage. How Pastor Wilson obtained this information became central to understanding the psychological dynamics preceding the murder. Digital forensics recovered text messages between Wilson and Naomi dating back to June 2021, when their affair began. In an exchange from August 2022, Naomi shared the secret about her husband's past during what appears to be a period of particular emotional vulnerability. "I've never told anyone," she wrote. "Dee thinks nobody knows, except his mother and me. It haunts him, even though his father was a monster who deserved worse." Wilson's response was chillingly calculated. "Thank you for trusting me with this. God uses our broken places to build his kingdom. This stays between us and the Lord." By March 2023, the relationship between Wilson and Naomi had begun deteriorating. Financial records show Wilson transferring church funds to personal accounts at an accelerated rate. Meanwhile, Naomi had discovered evidence of his involvement with both her daughter Genesis and sister-in-law Brianna. Text messages from the week before the final sermon show Naomi threatening to expose Wilson to church leadership. His response: "Remember, I know things too. About Darius. About things that could destroy everything you've built. Be very careful about the war you're thinking of starting." The coded message in Wilson's final sermon wasn't just spiritual rhetoric. It was a clear threat to expose Darius Jackson's darkest secret if his control over the family began slipping. What Wilson couldn't have known was that Darius had already begun uncovering the web of manipulation entangling his family. 3 days before the sermon, security cameras at Genesis Jackson's campus apartment captured Darius confronting his daughter. According to Genesis's later statement to investigators, her father showed her text messages between herself and Pastor Wilson that he had recovered from her cloud backup. "He knew everything," Genesis told detectives. "He didn't yell or threaten. He just asked me how long it had been happening. When I told him it started after my 21st birthday, he got this look, like something had broken inside him." Genesis revealed the pastor had initiated an inappropriate relationship during spiritual mentoring sessions, gradually convincing her that their connection was divinely sanctioned and must remain private, even from her mother. What makes the final sermon particularly significant to the investigation is that it confirms Wilson knew Darius was aware of at least one relationship. The pastor's calculated references to exposed secrets and divine judgment were not hypothetical warnings. They were counter-threats in a rapidly escalating psychological battle. Audio analysis of the sermon reveals subtle but measurable changes in Wilson's vocal patterns when delivering the most pointed messages. His speech slowed by approximately 15%. His tone dropped to a lower register, and micropauses preceded critical phrases, all techniques associated with deliberate psychological emphasis. "He wasn't just preaching," noted Dr. Davids. "He was engaging in what we call weaponized communication, using his position of spiritual authority to deliver what was essentially a veiled blackmail threat wrapped in religious language." The congregation's response, captured on video, shows most attendees engaged and responding with typical affirmations. Only 3 people appear noticeably disturbed: Darius, who remains rigidly still; Naomi, who repeatedly looks down at her hands; and Elder Clarence Williams, whose expression grows increasingly troubled as the sermon progresses. In his later statement, Williams recalled, "Something felt wrong that day. Samuel wasn't speaking God's word. He was using it like a weapon. I've been in ministry 40 years, and I've never heard scripture twisted quite that way. It wasn't until after everything happened that I understood what I was witnessing." Following the sermon, church security cameras captured a brief but tense interaction between Wilson and Darius in the church foyer. Though just 23 seconds long and without audio, body language experts note Wilson's posture communicates confidence while Darius displays controlled rage, tight jaw, fists clenched at his sides, minimal body movement. Their final exchange ended with Wilson placing his hand on Darius's shoulder, a gesture that appears pastoral to observers, but which psychological experts describe as a dominance display. Darius immediately stepped back, breaking the contact before walking away. Phone records show Darius made no calls for the remainder of that Sunday. His home security system recorded him entering his private office at 2:17 p.m., where he remained for over 6 hours with the door locked. When he emerged, security footage shows him carrying a small leather notebook, the same notebook later found in his car, containing what appears to be a methodical plan written in shorthand. The 7 days between the final sermon and Pastor Wilson's murder represent a critical timeline during which Darius Jackson systematically gathered evidence about Wilson's relationships with the women in his family. Credit card records show purchases from a digital forensics company specializing in recovering deleted messages. His home security logs reveal unusual patterns of reviewing archived footage, particularly focusing on timestamps when Naomi and Brianna left for church meetings. What Wilson could not have anticipated was how thoroughly his sermon would backfire. Rather than intimidating Darius into silence, the thinly veiled threat about his past appears to have eliminated any remaining hesitation. As one investigator noted, Wilson made a fatal miscalculation. He thought exposing Jackson's darkest secret would control him. Instead, it removed the last barrier holding him back. When you threaten a man who already believes he's damned, you don't gain leverage. You create someone with nothing left to lose. On the night of April 2nd, 2023, exactly 1 week after that final sermon, Darius Jackson's black Mercedes would enter the church parking lot late into the night. 3 hours and some minutes later, he would exit, leaving behind what crime scene analysts would later describe as a grotesque tableau of judgment. On April 4th, 2023, investigators faced a critical moment in the Wilson murder case. With evidence pointing to Darius Jackson and forensic analysis confirming blood spatter in his vehicle, the discovery of encrypted text messages between Pastor Wilson and Naomi Jackson added an entirely new dimension to the investigation. The relationship between Naomi Jackson and Pastor Samuel Wilson began in September 2021, according to digital forensics experts who recovered over 2,300 text messages from Wilson's hidden burner phone. The communications revealed a carefully orchestrated affair that evolved from what appeared to be innocent pastoral counseling into something far more calculated. The initial messages show a deliberate grooming process, noted by a forensic psychologist who analyzed the communications. Wilson positioned himself as a spiritual advisor addressing Naomi's marital concerns, then systematically introduced religious justifications for their relationship. Early messages from October 2021 show Naomi expressing guilt about discussing her marriage problems with someone outside the family. Wilson responded with biblical references about the importance of spiritual intimacy and how true connection often requires stepping outside conventional boundaries. By December 2021, the messages became explicitly romantic. Wilson frequently referenced the biblical story of David and Bathsheba, but with a disturbing reinterpretation suggesting their relationship was divinely sanctioned despite its adulterous nature. This religious manipulation became a consistent pattern in his communications with all 3 Jackson women. When detectives interviewed Naomi on April 5th, she initially attempted to minimize the relationship, claiming it had been primarily emotional and had ended months earlier. However, when presented with hotel receipts showing she and Wilson had shared accommodations as recently as March 28th, just 5 days before the murder, her carefully constructed narrative collapsed. "I didn't want to believe what was happening to my family," Naomi told investigators during her second interview. "Samuel had a way of making everything sound ordained by God. When I discovered he was also involved with Genesis, I threatened to expose him. That's when he reminded me he knew about Darius's past." Financial records revealed the material aspect of their relationship. Between January 2022 and March 2023, Wilson facilitated the creation of a private account for Naomi labeled as a ministry discretionary fund, but used exclusively for personal purchases. Credit card statements showed spa treatments, designer clothing, and weekend getaways totaling approximately $143,000. Expenditures hidden from family financial statements that Darius might review. The investigation revealed Naomi had discovered Wilson's manipulation of her daughter in mid-February 2023. But instead of immediately alerting Darius, she confronted Wilson privately. This crucial decision, maintaining secrecy while attempting to address the situation herself, created the window during which Wilson expanded his control over the family. 3 days after the discovery, Naomi withdrew $17,500 from her private account and transferred it to Genesis's student housing fund, an apparent attempt to financially separate her daughter from Wilson's influence without directly confronting the situation. Cell phone location data shows she visited Genesis's campus apartment that same day, but according to Genesis's later statement, her mother never mentioned Pastor Wilson during their conversation. By early March 2023, the relationship between Naomi and Wilson had fractured beyond repair. Text messages show increasing hostility, with Naomi threatening to tell Darius everything if Wilson didn't stay away from Genesis. Wilson's responses evolved from reassurance to subtle threats, frequently referencing how exposure would destroy everyone involved, including your husband's reputation and business. What Wilson couldn't have known was that Darius had already uncovered more than financial improprieties. Digital forensics later revealed that on March 10th, Darius had accessed Naomi's cloud backup during a routine system update of family devices. This accidentally synchronized deleted text exchanges between Naomi and Wilson from the previous 6 months. March 15th marked another critical juncture. Home security footage shows an unusual interaction between Darius and Naomi in their kitchen. Though maintaining a normal conversation about dinner plans, Darius passed Naomi a handwritten note. According to Naomi's statement, the note read, "Don't react. I know about Wilson. Phone and house might be monitored. Act normal. We'll handle it." This revelation provides crucial context for Darius's behavior in the following 2 weeks, maintaining normal appearances while systematically investigating Wilson's activities. It also explains why Naomi appeared increasingly anxious in public, while showing no signs of alerting Wilson to her husband's discoveries. By March 25th, the day before Wilson's final sermon, the psychological dynamics had shifted dramatically. Wilson believed he still maintained control through his financial leverage and knowledge of Darius's past. Naomi knew her husband was aware of at least her relationship with Wilson, but didn't know the full extent of his discoveries. And Darius had compiled evidence not just of Wilson's affair with his wife, but of the pastor's involvement with other family members. In her final police interview on April 10th, Naomi made a statement that investigators described as the perfect distillation of Wilson's manipulation tactics. She said, "Samuel convinced each of us that we were special, uniquely chosen for a spiritual purpose only he understood. He kept us separate, making each relationship feel sacred and secret. By the time I realized what was happening to my family, we were all too entangled to escape without destroying everything we'd built. I was too ashamed to tell Darius, too afraid to confront Samuel directly, and too protective to ask Genesis or Brianna directly. So we all suffered alone, together." As the investigation progressed beyond Naomi's involvement, detectives were left with a disturbing question. If Wilson's relationship with Naomi represented just one facet of his manipulation, what additional revelations would emerge from the experiences of Genesis and Brianna Jackson? On April 6, 2023, Genesis Jackson walked into the police station voluntarily, requesting to speak with detectives investigating Pastor Wilson's murder. Her statement would fundamentally alter investigators' understanding of the case and reveal the systematic way Wilson exploited vulnerabilities within the Jackson family. "I need to tell you about my relationship with Pastor Samuel," Genesis began, her composure a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil evident in her academic withdrawal papers filed just weeks earlier. "My father didn't kill him because of what happened with my mother." Genesis's testimony, recorded over 5 hours, revealed a calculated grooming process that began shortly after her 20th birthday. As youth choir director, she had regular private meetings with Wilson to discuss ministry leadership development. These meetings gradually evolved from church offices to coffee shops, then to private dinners, and eventually to the lakefront cabin investigators had discovered in Wilson's hidden assets. He said I had a special calling, that God had revealed to him I was meant for something beyond ordinary ministry, Genesis explained. He called it sacred mentorship. Said it was a spiritual tradition dating back to biblical times that most modern Christians were too immature to understand. Digital forensics recovered text messages Wilson sent Genesis throughout 2022, showing his systematic isolation techniques. One particularly revealing message read, "Your peers cannot understand your spiritual journey. Their confusion and judgment come from spiritual immaturity. This is why the special relationship between mentor and disciple must remain private. Not because it's wrong, but because others aren't prepared to understand its significance." The relationship escalated to physical intimacy in December 2022, coinciding with what Genesis described as her spiritual commitment ceremony at Wilson's cabin. Location data from her phone confirmed weekly visits to the property through March 2023, always returning to campus late at night. Most disturbing was Wilson's deliberate triangulation of the Jackson women. Genesis described how Wilson would mention counseling her mother through family difficulties or working with her aunt on special church projects, while ensuring neither fully knew about his relationship with the others. He told me my mother wouldn't understand our connection because she was a spiritually conventional, Genesis recounted. Said I should never mention our special studies to her or anyone else because it would only create confusion and possibly damage my mother's more basic faith. While investigators were still processing Genesis's testimony, Breonna Jackson's story emerged through a different channel. On April 7th, emergency department records show she was admitted following a medication overdose, characterized in medical reports as a suicide attempt with ambivalent intent. During her psychiatric evaluation, she disclosed her relationship with Pastor Wilson to healthcare providers, who then contacted investigators under mandatory reporting requirements. Breonna's experience revealed yet another dimension of Wilson's predatory pattern. As someone with a history of abusive relationships, she had been particularly vulnerable to his manipulative tactics. When she joined the church administrative staff in 2018, Wilson quickly identified her past trauma and financial insecurity as leverage points. Unlike his approaches with Naomi and Genesis, Wilson's control over Breonna began through financial assistance and professional advancement before escalating to exploitation. It was never presented as a romantic relationship, Breonna explained from her hospital bed. Samuel called it spiritual submission and serving the church leadership in all ways required. Her medical records revealed another disturbing element. In January 2021, Breonna had been prescribed anxiety medication following what her doctor noted as increasing workplace stress. By November 2022, her dosage had doubled. Toxicology screening during her hospitalization showed she had been taking nearly triple her prescribed dose in the weeks before Wilson's murder. Most revealing was the timeline of Breonna's exploitation. Employment records show her promotion to Director of Pastoral Care came just 2 weeks after Wilson first coerced her into physical intimacy. The position, created specifically for her, increased her salary by 60% while requiring extensive private prayer and planning sessions. With Wilson, sessions that security footage showed often occurred after other staff had left for the evening. Unlike Naomi and Genesis, Breonna experienced more explicit coercion. In February 2023, when she attempted to establish boundaries with Wilson, he reminded her of a narcotic medication discrepancy during her previous nursing employment, information he promised to keep confidential when she first joined the church staff. According to Breonna's statement, Wilson indicated this information would unfortunately need to be shared with the appropriate authorities if their special relationship changed. What none of the Jackson women knew until the investigation was how thoroughly Wilson documented his exploitation. Hidden camera footage recovered from his lake house captured intimate encounters with all three women, meticulously labeled and stored. Forensic analysts found these recordings had been reviewed multiple times, suggesting Wilson derived satisfaction from not just the acts themselves, but from his orchestration of the family's exploitation. The separate testimonies of Genesis and Brianna revealed crucial information about the days immediately preceding Wilson's murder. When Darius Jackson began uncovering these separate threads in March 2023, he wasn't just discovering his wife's infidelity, he was realizing the complete infiltration of his family by a predator using spiritual authority as his primary weapon. This understanding would prove crucial to comprehending the level of calculated rage evident in Wilson's murder. The night of April 2nd, 2023, represented the culmination of weeks of mounting tension between Darius Jackson and Pastor Samuel Wilson. By reconstructing evidence from multiple sources, security footage, forensic analysis, cell phone data, and Jackson's eventual testimony, investigators assembled a comprehensive timeline of the events leading to Wilson's brutal murder. At 5:14 p.m. on Sunday, April 2nd, Jackson attended the evening service at Wilson's church, sitting in his usual front row seat despite having missed the morning worship for the first time in years. Security footage shows him maintaining a composed demeanor throughout the service, though he avoided the usual post-service handshake with Wilson, exiting through a side door instead. Cell phone records place Jackson at his home from 6:32 p.m. until 9:48 p.m. During this period, he accessed his secure files on Wilson's activities one final time, reviewed security footage showing Wilson's separate interactions with Naomi, Genesis, and Brianna, and deleted his browser history. At 9:53 p.m., security cameras captured Jackson removing a small case from his office safe, later identified as containing the sedative medication prescribed to Brianna. Home security footage shows him leaving at 10:01 p.m. after briefly stopping in the kitchen to retrieve an item from a drawer. Though the camera angle obscured what he took, investigators later identified a missing carving knife. The level of preparation suggests not just premeditation, but a forensically aware approach to the planned confrontation, noted lead crime scene analyst Teresa Wells. Jackson disabled the home security system's cloud backup before leaving, changed into nondescript dark clothing, and wore latex gloves recovered later from his vehicle. These aren't the actions of someone in an uncontrolled rage. Jackson's Mercedes arrived at the church parking lot at 10:12 p.m., parking in a blind spot not covered by external cameras. Using an access code obtained from his wife's diary, he entered through a side door and immediately disabled the main security system, a task requiring specific knowledge of the church's security protocols. What he didn't know was that the recent renovation had included an upgraded backup system operating independently from the main controls. This secondary system captured Jackson methodically preparing the pastor's study, arranging chairs, placing a bottle of water on the desk, and carefully positioning himself behind the door. At 10:47 p.m., he sent a text message from a prepaid phone purchased 3 days earlier. "Need to discuss financial discrepancies tonight. Extremely urgent. Can you meet me at your office? Darius." Wilson's response, sent at 10:52 p.m. "Give me 30 minutes. Don't mention this to anyone. We can resolve this privately." Phone location data shows Wilson arriving at the church at 11:27 p.m., entering through his private entrance that connected directly to his study. The secondary security system captured the initial confrontation, Wilson appearing startled to find Jackson already inside his office, a brief conversation with both men seated, and Wilson becoming visibly agitated as Jackson placed a laptop on the desk and turned the screen toward him. Though the system recorded no audio, forensic lip readers analyzed the footage. According to their analysis, Jackson said, "I know about everything. Naomi, Genesis, Brianna, the money, the recordings, all of it." Wilson initially attempted to maintain composure, appearing to offer explanations. Approximately 4 minutes into the conversation, Jackson opened a folded document and placed it before Wilson. Crime scene investigators later identified this as a printout of Wilson's Jackson Family Spiritual Development Plan. At 11:36 p.m., the footage shows Wilson standing suddenly, appearing to issue threats. According to lip-reading analysis, he stated, "Nobody will believe you over me. I know what you did to your father. Think about what this will do to your family." The confrontation's turning point occurred at 11:38 p.m., when Jackson calmly offered Wilson the bottle of water he had positioned earlier, under the disguise of calming the storm, so they could have a manly resolution. Toxicology reports would later confirm the water contained a dissolved sedative, the same medication prescribed to Brianna for anxiety, but at approximately 3 times the therapeutic dose. The choice of sedative is significant, explained forensic toxicologist Dr. Sarah Wendell. This particular medication causes muscle relaxation and disorientation before unconsciousness. The victim would remain partially aware, but physically incapacitated for several minutes before losing consciousness completely. The security footage shows Wilson becoming progressively disoriented over the next 7 minutes, initially trying to reach for his phone before losing coordination. By 11:47 p.m., he appeared unable to remain upright in his chair, slumping forward onto his desk. At 11:52 p.m., Jackson is seen methodically checking Wilson's pulse and pupil responses, confirming the sedative's full effect. What followed was captured only partially by the security system, as Jackson covered the main camera with a cloth at 11:55 p.m. However, a secondary angle from a camera concealed in a bookshelf, part of Wilson's own surveillance system, documented the subsequent events in disturbing detail. Jackson retrieved the ceremonial communion knife from Wilson's display case, rather than using the kitchen knife he had brought. Forensic analysis indicated this choice held symbolic significance, using the instrument of Wilson's spiritual authority to end his life. The pastor was still breathing, but completely incapacitated when Jackson began the methodical execution. The knife wounds indicate precision, rather than frenzy, as noted by a medical examiner. The initial wounds targeted vital organs in a sequence suggesting anatomical knowledge. Each cut was deliberate, with minimal hesitation marks. The victim was alive, but completely sedated for the initial wounds, only losing consciousness as blood loss progressed. Between 12:08 a.m. and 12:34 a.m., Jackson completed the killing phase of his attack. What followed was even more disturbing. Approximately 90 minutes of methodical dismemberment, with each body part carefully positioned in the arrangement discovered the following morning. Crime scene analysts identified the positioning as significant. "The arrangement wasn't random," explained forensic psychologist Dr. Lauren Washington. Wilson's dismembered parts were placed in a deliberate inversion of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, a painting depicting Jesus with his disciples. In Jackson's arrangement, Wilson's torso remained in his chair at the center, with limbs and head positioned where disciples would be seated. This suggests a calculated statement about Wilson's perversion of his spiritual authority. Throughout this process, security footage shows Jackson working with unsettling composure, stopping occasionally to clean the knife, rearranging certain elements for precise alignment, and at one point appearing to speak to Wilson's remains, though no audio was captured. At 1:18 a.m., Jackson methodically cleaned areas he had touched, wiped down surfaces for fingerprints, and placed the communion knife prominently on Wilson's open Bible, positioned to point at a highlighted verse from Jeremiah. "But your eyes and your heart are set only on dishonest gain, on shedding innocent blood, and on oppression and extortion." Jackson exited the church at 1:26 a.m., driving directly to Lake Lanier, where cell phone tower data places him from approximately 2:15 a.m. until 3:30 a.m. Investigators later discovered several items in the lake's depths near this location: Jackson's blood-stained clothing, his latex gloves, and a phone believed to contain evidence of Wilson's manipulation. The kitchen knife from Jackson's home was never recovered, suggesting he disposed of it elsewhere, despite not using it in the actual murder. By 4:17 a.m., Jackson had returned home, showered, and resumed his normal routine. Security footage shows him reviewing financial documents in his office at 7:30 a.m., placing routine business calls by 8:15 a.m., and behaving with such normalcy that family members noticed nothing unusual. When detectives arrived at his home following the discovery of Wilson's body, Jackson displayed what investigators described as unnatural calm. During his initial 12-hour interrogation, Jackson maintained absolute silence, requesting an attorney only when formally charged. However, in his subsequent documented confession on April 11th, he provided a detailed account that aligned precisely with the forensic evidence, offering insights into his psychological state during the killing. "I wasn't angry when I killed him," Jackson stated in the recorded confession. Anger was what he expected, what he'd prepared for. He'd constructed leverage against an emotional response. What he wasn't prepared for was methodical elimination. When asked about the extensive dismemberment, Jackson articulated what would become central to both prosecution and defense strategies. "Wilson spent years dismembering my family while presenting himself as a man of God. He separated us from each other while maintaining his image of wholeness. The dismemberment wasn't vengeance, it was truth. I wanted his physical form to reflect what he truly was: fragmented, divided, hollow at his core." Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Jackson noted the dissociative state he appeared to enter when discussing the murder itself, a psychological mechanism enabling him to compartmentalize extreme violence while maintaining rational function in other aspects of life. This assessment would prove crucial to the legal proceedings, raising profound questions about criminal responsibility. Had Jackson experienced a psychiatric break that diminished his capacity for rational thought? Or had he made a calculated decision that Wilson's continued existence posed such a threat to his family that murder became, in his mind, a rational response? As the case moved toward trial, this final confrontation between predator and protector, between a pastor who weaponized spiritual authority and a man whose traumatic past made him uniquely vulnerable to such manipulation, would force the justice system to confront uncomfortable questions about moral culpability in the context of extraordinary psychological manipulation. By late April 2023, as the investigation into Pastor Wilson's murder concluded, attention shifted to the judicial proceedings against Darius Jackson. The district attorney's office faced unprecedented challenges prosecuting a case where the physical evidence was unambiguous, but the psychological context extraordinarily complex. On April 17th, Jackson was formally charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances of premeditation and extreme cruelty. The prosecution's initial filing described the killing as a calculated execution carried out with meticulous planning and exceptional brutality, seeking the maximum penalty available under Georgia law. The lead prosecutor assembled a straightforward case based on overwhelming physical evidence: security footage placing Jackson at the scene, forensic evidence linking him to the murder weapon, his methodical dismemberment of Wilson's body, and his own detailed confession. The state's case portrayed Jackson as a calculating killer who, upon discovering his wife's infidelity, conducted extensive planning before executing Wilson with cold-blooded precision. The defense strategy acknowledged Jackson's responsibility for Wilson's death, while presenting a revolutionary approach to criminal intent. Rather than claiming temporary insanity or diminished capacity, they introduced what legal scholars would later term the systematic exploitation defense, arguing that Wilson's calculated destruction of the Jackson family through psychological, spiritual, and financial means created a context where Jackson's actions represented a desperate protection response rather than criminal intent. What happened in that church office wasn't just about a man killing another man, they stated in his opening argument. This case requires us to understand how a lifetime of psychological conditioning, combined with the systematic exploitation of an entire family, can fundamentally alter human perception of moral choice. The trial, which began on June 12, 2023, revealed the profound divisions within the community. Church members separated into two distinct factions: those who refused to believe Wilson's misconduct despite overwhelming evidence, and those who recognized the pastor's predatory pattern but struggled with the brutality of Jackson's response. The turning point came during the second week of trial, when all three Jackson women testified, providing first-hand accounts of Wilson's systematic exploitation. Their sequential testimony revealed how Wilson had isolated them from one another while creating separate spiritual justifications for his abuse of each relationship. Genesis Jackson's testimony proved particularly powerful, describing how Wilson had exploited her desire for spiritual mentorship, gradually normalizing increasingly inappropriate behavior through religious manipulation. Court transcripts record her statement. "He convinced me that what was happening between us was divinely ordained, that ordinary people couldn't understand the special nature of spiritual intimacy. By the time I realized it was manipulation, I felt too ashamed and trapped to tell anyone, especially my parents." Expert testimony established the sophisticated psychological techniques Wilson employed, identifying and exploiting vulnerability, creating dependency, using spiritual authority to override normal ethical boundaries, and employing confidential information as leverage when his control was threatened. The most controversial evidence came from Maya Wilson, the pastor's widow, who testified for the defense in a stunning reversal. Though initially supporting the prosecution, her perspective shifted after reviewing the evidence of her husband's extensive misconduct. "I lived with Samuel for 20 years, but never truly knew him," she stated. "The man revealed through this investigation isn't the man I thought I married. I cannot defend what he did to these women, or what he intended to do when he realized he was losing control." The trial concluded on July 7th with closing arguments that framed fundamentally different views of criminal responsibility. As the jury began deliberations, the central question before the jury transcended simple guilt or innocence. To what extent should extraordinary psychological manipulation mitigate responsibility for even the most calculated acts of violence? The answer would come soon. After 76 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict on July 10, 2023. Jackson was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, a significant reduction from the charges sought by the prosecution. The jury foreman's statement, read aloud to a packed courtroom, explained their reasoning. "While we unanimously agree Mr. Jackson killed Pastor Wilson with clear premeditation, we find that the extraordinary pattern of psychological exploitation, spiritual manipulation, and familial destruction constitutes significant mitigating circumstances that substantially diminished his capacity for rational judgment." The judge sentenced Jackson to 15 years, with potential parole eligibility, after serving 7 years, far less than the life sentence the prosecution had requested. In her remarks, the judge acknowledged the unprecedented nature of the case. "Our legal system struggles to address situations where traditional concepts of victim and perpetrator become blurred by systematic psychological manipulation. This sentence reflects both the severity of Mr. Jackson's actions and the extraordinary context in which they occurred." For the Jackson family, the aftermath brought both healing and irreparable fractures. Naomi filed for divorce in August 2023, unable to reconcile the destruction of their family unit. Court documents indicate she waived all claims to family assets, requesting only funds to establish a foundation supporting victims of clergy abuse. Genesis withdrew from college, entering intensive therapy to address the psychological manipulation she had experienced. In September, she established an online support group for victims of spiritual exploitation that rapidly grew to over 300 members, revealing the disturbing prevalence of similar cases nationwide. Breonna Jackson perhaps experienced the most profound transformation. After completing treatment for her medication dependency, she enrolled in a counseling psychology program, specializing in religious trauma recovery. Her statement to the parole board supporting her brother's early release emphasized the systemic failures that enabled Wilson's decades of predation. The true tragedy isn't just what happened to our family, but how many institutions helped create an environment where someone like Samuel Wilson could operate with impunity for decades. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue came from Maya Wilson, who declined to reclaim her husband's remains after the investigation concluded. When asked by reporters what should happen to Samuel Wilson's legacy, she replied, "Let it be dismembered and scattered, just like the lives he damaged. The greatest justice would be if his name is forgotten, while the lessons of how he operated are remembered. What a life! What a crazy series of events!" This is the story of Pastor Wilson's murder. If you love stories like this, do well to share and subscribe to True Crimes Corner. You never know what's coming next. Don't miss out. See you again.